Good evening. Delighted to see you all here. I'm Dave Satterfield. I'm director of Rice University's Baker Institute. We are very pleased tonight, and I know you all will be as well, to have an exceptional speaker, Bob Zoellick, who is an old colleague and friend, but more important than either of those things, able to speak to a number of the issues which are very much the focus or focuses of national dialogue, international dialogue today. And just a moment here, and it will only be a moment, Bob, about your extraordinary career in government finance and international institutions. Bob was the 11th president of the World Bank Group from 2007 to 2012. He guided that international financial institution through the global financial crisis, expanded its capital resources, and sharpened the focus on anti-corruption, transparency, and development in fragile states. Earlier, he served as the U.S. Trade Representative from 2001 to 2005, when he was the architect of major trade agreements. You all remember trade agreements, I think. And was Deputy Secretary of State 2005-2006, and that was a critical period in beginning to redirect the Foreign Service and the work of the State Department towards what came to be known as expeditionary diplomacy, not just in the security sense, but also in the business, promotion, commercial, and economic fields. Bob was the President's personal representative, the Sherpa, to the G7 economic summits in 91-92. He served with Secretary Baker, our founder, at the Treasury Department, at the State Department, as well as Deputy Chief of Staff at the White House and assistant to the President. He continues his work in U.S. and global economics as chair of the Americas at Temasek, Singapore's sovereign wealth fund, and through service on many boards, including the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Joining him tonight, we're going to double team you, Bob, is my colleague, Dr. John Diamond. He is the Edward and Hermanna Hancock Kelly Senior Fellow in Public Finance, director of our Center for Public Finance, or Trade and Budget here at the Institute, and a professor of economics at Rice University. John is one of the country's leading experts on tax and budget, and his research informs debates here and in Washington on corporate and individual tax reform, pensions, and fiscal sustainability. These are going to be two individuals who can both ask questions and be asked questions on global trade, economic diplomacy, and fiscal policy. And above all, thoughts on how the U.S. is, can, will navigate an era of fiscal strain, global competition, political stress, and shifting dynamics abroad and at home. Please join me in welcoming Bob Zoellick and John Diamond and thanking those who made this event possible, the Shell Distinguished Lecture Series and Shell Oil. Thank you. Bob, I'm going to start off, because I get the privilege of doing that, with a question that isn't focused on trade policy. It's focused on something else entirely. George H.W. Bush, Jim Baker, their relationship, what that allowed them to do in terms of dealing with the extraordinary set of challenges that that Bush 41 administration faced. The fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, German reunification, emergent trade challenges to the United States, the WTO, and what it could or should be doing, as well as Saddam's invasion of Kuwait and the formation of the coalition. What made that period unique? What made it work? And thoughts from you on Jim Baker.
So first, David, thank you for the invitation. Thank you to John. Thanks to all of you. My primary title in life was Baker Aide. So in the world that I lived in, that was the prime currency. And I've had an opportunity to come to this institute before, and I want to thank all of you and Shell and others for the support, because Baker was an absolutely superb boss. You would have been amazed to sort of see him in action. Susan Baker, I know, also has been fantastic in terms of her the commitment on so many of these issues. So I want to thank them. But David, I'd have to ask if you could relay one thing to Secretary Baker, which is in the Baker style, I roamed around and looked at the pictures, and I found mine way over there, but it is by the men's bathroom. And so at first I was a little concerned, and I figured, well, pretty much at least half the audience has to go to the men's bathroom. So it's okay, but please ask him if maybe, I don't know.
I'll spare you what we had to do with the Dan Quayle cartoon when
okay.
Dan Quayle came here.
Okay. But also, I want to recognize, since you talked about USTR, Lynette, who's played such a key role, was a colleague of mine at USTR and did a fantastic job in Geneva and the WTO after a great business career. So I'm delighted to start out with Bush 41 and Baker, because again, to give you a little context here, I was mentioning a British friend of mine says, I spend most of my time now, Bob, either speaking at memorial events or for PhD research on dissertations. And so I spend a lot of time with people that are examining the Bush 41 years and for histories. And a key point that I've made, Philip Zellico, who is at Virginia, now at Hoover, has made, I don't think you can understand the nature of the foreign policy in those years without understanding the nature of the Bush-Baker relationship. In the world, the U.S. really hadn't seen anything like this since maybe Jefferson and Madison, as a president and secretary of state. And in many respects, Bush and Baker were even a closer partnership. Some people use the reference of an older and younger brother, and it was in some ways that was the nature of it. But because many people jump to foreign policy concepts, I think they sometimes overlook the human nature of it. Both these people were extremely competitive men, okay? They wanted to win, okay? Now, they were gentlemen, and in that sense, their use of power was always very measured. They would not sort of humiliate somebody or take advantage of somebody for just lack of discipline. It was always a purpose. One of the things that was said about Baker, which of course made it good to work for them, as you know, was, he was somebody who you wanted as your friend, and you certainly didn't want to make him your enemy, okay? So in some ways, he encompassed kind of the nature of American power, but in a restrained way, not kind of overuse. Now, the other aspect, though, that I think is important is that the two had different roles while friends. They were competitive with one another, but they were always watching out for one another. And so that gave an authority of a Secretary of State to operate as, frankly, you haven't seen since. Just because of the nature of the two's relationship. Of the two, Baker was the action officer. As you know, Baker was always focused on results, getting things done. What do you accomplish? So it wasn't meetings, it wasn't just speeches, it was the product. President Bush, of course, was the ultimate decision maker. And in some ways, if you look at President Bush 41's life, it almost encompassed the sort of American post-World War II experience. He's this naval war hero. He serves in the Congress. He serves at the UN overseas. And so in some ways, the policy was almost an embodiment of who he was and what he believed America should be. What a number of commentators often miss is that this did have a strategic element, but it wasn't strategic in the way, say, Kissinger's concepts would be. It operated in sort of a different form. As people kind of look at the nature of their work on these various crises, but also the things that they prepared for the future. So particularly in Texas, while most of the focus, of course, of historians is on end of the Cold War, peaceful end, Germany, Soviet Union, Gulf Coalition, NAFTA, which was a critical device, frankly, for the American continent sort of going forward. The WTO negotiations that they really broke the back of to create an international trading system. APEC, which I work with Baker on in the Asia Pacific. And one that I noticed isn't even recorded at the Bush Library was the only global climate change treaty ever ratified, was the one in '92 that we did in the Bush administration, which was the framework agreement for all that sort of went past. So what was interesting was at the same time these two individuals were deploying American power effectively in the critical issues ending the Cold War, they were starting to shape the environment for the period sort of afterwards. One last little anecdotal piece that might interest people. Bush, since he had been an intelligence head of the CIA, and he always loved that job, was a consummate consumer of information. And so his intelligence briefers always found this to be a fantastic experience. But Baker, even though he was so close to Bush and would speak to him various times a day, understood, perhaps as a lawyer, the need to keep your principle interconnected. So one of the things I pointed out to historians is that every night when we were traveling, either Dennis Ross or I or both of us would be with Baker and Margaret Tutwiler, we'd do a night note, one page, just one page. And it would be on the top of Bush's intelligence file the next day. And it was kind of Baker's recording from the front about the people, the events, kind of the insights in the situation. And this was a key part of Bush's diplomacy. As you may know, some foreign leaders were shocked in the beginning of his administration because they'd get a message saying, the President of the United States is on the line. And the President of the United States is calling me, and Bush would just be calling to kind of get information and sense. So what I was trying to draw out with this is that sometimes foreign policy is seen in pure sort of objective analytical terms. People matter. And these two people and the partnership they created and their use of American power and their complementary skills, we were fortunate as a country at a critical moment in time.
What Jim Baker summarizes in just a few words as pragmatism with principles as the basis for his policy. And so take us from there, Bob, to the current picture. And I know you are not an unrelieved pessimist. Give us your thoughts.
Well, I have an advantage now. At my age, I get to be a contrarian. So I get to say things that are not always so popular, but nevertheless, the Wall Street Journal prints my stuff. So look, we're at a huge period of disruption. And part of this is the United States, part of this is events in the world. We just met with some of the Rice students, and we were talking about the effects on demographic change. We're talking about the effects of AI and technology. We're talking the effects of that on energy use. But at the level which we worked, the United States created an alliance system for 75 years after World War II that went through its various stress points, but was frankly a way for the U.S. to leverage its power and exert leadership. As you know, people just didn't follow orders. This is where Bush and Baker's skills were very effective at putting together coalitions. But I think it is, a lot of those alliance relationships are at risk now. People don't know whether they can trust the United States, whether they can rely on the word. You take a recent example of yesterday. So President Trump talks about Russia and the Baltics, but is he just popping off, or does he really mean that if somebody shoots down a Russian plane that the U.S. will be there? People just don't know the answer to that. Yeah? In the area of trade and economics, again, the U.S. helped create an international trading and economic system which certainly served America's interest, but it served other people's interest. It was a win-win venture. That is now a question mark. And whether the United States will create more barriers, more limits, as I've written in a different context, I think part of it is people keep waiting for the new order to form, and I don't think the new order is going to form. I don't think there'll be an end state because President Trump just likes to use tariffs as a tool and leverage. Internationally, the United States still has tremendous assets and capacities, okay? But as I mentioned in the Bush-Baker years, you don't want to just use those willy-nilly and without a purpose. You want to have a focus. I can give you a number of examples where Baker probably scared the living daylights out of his counterpart, but it was always for a particular purpose. It wasn't just gratuitous. Okay? And then on the other hand, both he and President Bush created the sense that the United States was a good and reliable friend. So all those are in question. Now, there are debates about the nature of the U.S. economy. Another big issue that over time we were talking about is the debt level, which is just getting out of control. So on the one hand, if there were any country in the world whose hand I'd want to play, it would be the U.S., but I have some questions about how we're playing the cards.
I'm going to turn this over to John now.
So given that the record level trade deficits and 100% of GDP debt levels in the United States, and then I'm going to draw from your book America in the World, the U.S. history of diplomacy and foreign policy, which I highly recommend. I learned a lot from it. You speak about Hamilton being really good at not just reacting to policy, but shaping policy. That seems to have been something that happened a lot under Bush and your boss James Baker. I think under Reagan, even under Clinton, potentially. Have we lost that? Because it feels like we've lost it in the disjointed trade policy that we live under now. What is the hope that another administration in the future can regain or resettle America's position in the world? So using history, how do you look forward about America's prospects in the trade front?
I worked for Baker. I didn't extend all the way to the Hamilton period. But I have great admiration for Hamilton. And one of the points which you're drawing out is, well, Hamilton was a soldier. He was a colonel. He commanded one of the last assaults at Yorktown. He understood the importance of economy and credit to security. And so, and his writings are full of this. It shows up in Washington's farewell address. He had observed that Britain was able to sustain this long war 3,000 miles away over 7 or 8 years because of the power of its credit, which, by the way, helped the Pitts win the Napoleonic Wars too. And so his intent was to design a structure, which he did with the restructuring of the debt, to sort of create America's credit for the future. And it's worth just spending a moment on this because it runs throughout American history. It's one of these things that we take for granted. So I know you guys aren't quite part of the Louisiana Purchase, but you're nearby. And so Jefferson would have never been able to buy Louisiana except for Hamilton's credit system. The Louisiana Purchase was $11.25 million. The federal budget at the time was like $9 million. Okay, so basically, if it hadn't been for Hamilton's bonds, you couldn't have bought Louisiana. Okay, I don't have the numbers at the tip of my tongue anymore, but if you look at the Civil War, where again you guys were unfortunately on the wrong side, but if you look at the federal debt prior to the Civil War and after the Civil War, it goes from like about 100 million to like 1.6 or 1.7 billion dollars. The U.S. had the ability to finance a war. The Confederacy didn't have the ability to do that. World War I, the U.S. basically pays for the war and its allies. There's World War II and sort of the Cold War. So it's one of these assets that we have that you got to be a little careful about sort of spending it all, right? And so you mentioned post-war high for debt, 1946, I think 104 or 106%. We're now at about 100%. What that means is that the interest that we pay on our debt is now bigger than the defense budget. In my world, it's bigger than Medicare, which is important for me, and maybe a lot of you. And so, the nature of credit, as we were discussing, is you never know when it breaks, right? So For those of you interested in international affairs, look at what's going on in France right now. There's a sense that maybe France not only has lost control of the budget, but that the government won't be able to fix the problem. So French corporates like AXA are now trading better than the French debt. Okay, so the problem with this is that if you think about global financial crisis, pandemic, you want that insurance policy. You want the ability to deal with a set of extreme, which is what we're not doing. So that's one little piece of the question you asked. In terms of kind of what the U.S. could sort of do or go beyond this, again, I have some interconnection even with the technology world, even though I'm not a technologist. The innovative capacities in this country, the entrepreneurship, in this one Texas was part of, it's interesting if you think of something like fracking. Okay, that was an existing technology, but the U.S. has a system where some guys have an idea, they want to push it, they want to test it, and they can revolutionize the supply of energy markets. There are other places in the world don't have that. So these are all amazing strengths, but you have to keep in mind we're about 4% of the world's population. There are other powerful countries that are either threatening to disrupt the system like China or Russia, which are disrupting the system with sort of aggressions and war. So how do you leverage your strengths, okay? And when you sort of come back to kind of the U.S. role, there really is no other country that can do it like the U.S., but the U.S. has to think about how to do it.
So how should we do it, specifically in regards to our neighbors, Mexico and China? And let's pit that against Canada, sorry, Mexico and Canada.
I don't know where you're living, but
yeah, it's a different place. And let's compare that to how we should interact with China. Do we decouple? Is there still interdependence if we decouple? So how do we treat our neighbors? How do we treat our enemies?
Okay, I'm going to do a little detour back to history in this because it fits the Baker and Bush era. So in some ways, the NAFTA was always much more than a trade agreement. And this is going back to the origins of this. Ronald Reagan, when he ran for office in '79, in his opening speech of his candidacy, says, we'd be better off if Mexico and Canada are stronger, not weaker, and it's time that we stop seeing our nearest neighbors as foreigners. This is the type of thing Reagan did. He had this vision about kind of the importance of this. And in the typical form, the Canada Free Trade Agreement, which, by the way, Baker stepped in at the Treasury Department to finish because it was coming apart, and then NAFTA was the start of this. Now, be a little interesting insight. I was working for Baker at the State Department at the time, and the initiative had to come from Mexico. And some of you may remember Carlos Salinas was the president. The PRI was sort of breaking down, and sort of the question was not just economically, but as the old PRI structure broke down, could we connect more of Mexican society and institutions with the United States? And so I saw this in very much strategic terms. The U.S. trade representative, which I led 10 years later, was wary of this because it just wanted to focus on the global agreement. But I had a hidden advantage. I had a president from Texas, I had a Secretary of State from Texas, and a Secretary of Commerce from Texas. And I never quite sure understand why this happened, given the war you guys fought, but nevertheless, Texans and Mexicans seem to have this sort of complex affinity. And so they understood the importance of Mexico's success in this. So coming back to this is that, in some ways, the integration that has occurred over 30 or 40 years, I think was significant enough that it was hard for President Trump in his first administration, as Dave was saying, to sort of kill the agreement, so it's renegotiated. But so, what's the future? Well, number one, don't we want Mexico to grow? Don't we want it to be more successful as a democracy? You're never going to deal with all the organized crime and narcotics issues if you don't have a healthy society, so that's going to be an important part of it. And by the way, if we can expand Mexico's capacities, in some ways they're complementary with the U.S., so I also saw the three-way agreement as a continental base for the U.S. to be more powerful globally. Now you got 500 million people, energy independence, security, sort of greater cooperation, whether environment or immigration. But of course you have to treat people in a certain way, right? And so, knocking them around or insulting them is not normally the future of diplomacy as I saw it. and so we'll have to see what goes forward on this. Now you threw in the China aspect. And I think, and David, I know that the Baker Institute is doing some work on this. When the USMCA gets renegotiated, there will be an issue of sensitivity about Chinese production coming into the United States through Mexico. And if it's just transshipment, I can understand that. But you also have to ask yourself, product by product, how does it really affect U.S. national security? So one that we were talking about with the students is, we have, at least some Americans want to have the alternative of solar energy. Well, Chinese solar panels are much more efficient, they're lower cost. What exactly is the security concern about having Chinese solar panels? Okay, or wind or other, when frankly, if you want to learn more about battery technology, you have the Chinese invest in battery technology here. So I've dealt with a number of wars, I understand the security side, but I've also seen that people who want to protect things will wave the flag of security to basically because they don't want to face the competition. And I think that would be bad for all of us. So I think the biggest issue for Mexico, frankly, will be the rule of law and the security and the issues related to organized crime and narcotics. I don't think we'll be able to deal with those effectively unless we build the types of trust and partnerships so we can share intelligence and frankly other operations as need be against that security threat. And then the poor Canadians, for goodness sakes, what did they do wrong that we're beating up on them? There's a wonderful movie that somebody should show at the White House. I forget the name. It was where the Canadian ambassadors in Iran sort of saved the American diplomats. Yeah.
Fargo.
And I can tell you, because I worked a lot with Canada as well, you had a implicit sort of question there. It can't go back to exactly the way it was. Okay. Mark Carney, who's the new prime minister, I work closely with him, a very smart guy. He went to Harvard, he worked at Goldman Sachs, he's very pro-American. Now, the benefit is that President Trump helped get him elected because people were angry at the US policy. But he's got to now diversify their situation. They can't rely on the United States. How does that help the United States? Okay. So going back to your bigger question, look, trust is the coin of the realm. And going back to Baker and Bush, at a personal level, their word was good. People could trust them and with their life or their economy or others. If you can't trust a country, you're selling at a huge discount. Now, can we regain that? To a degree, yes. It depends on the people, on the policies. The U.S. attractive capacity is huge because of our universities and the industry and the economy and so on and so forth. But it's like many of you are business people. You don't take your assets, you just don't take them for granted, and you certainly don't waste them.
Bob, if I could follow on John's question with a more meta posed to you. What is the theory of the case now about the basic concept of international trade? Is it zero sum? Is it isolationist? Is it protectionist? Is it all the above?
So let me take the U.S. first, and then let's save a little time for international. So, as I mentioned, I think President Trump sees tariffs as a handy tool. And whether he will use those to protect markets, open markets, raise revenue, clobber people because of the judicial system, go after them from fentanyl, he's not going to stop. It's his transactional nature. He's going to want to have this as a tool. So one of the pieces that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal made this point about don't expect an end state. This is going to keep going. Now, what does that mean for the United States? Well, it means costs will go up, there'll be price effects, there's an uncertainty effect that is particularly troublesome, and then you get the distortion of sort of investment patterns. So net, doesn't look so good to me. People, by the way, talk about the revenue aspect. Just to put this in perspective, the U.S. raised about $80 billion a year from tariff revenues before President Trump. Maybe now it can go up to $300 billion. The U.S. Sort of tax revenues at the federal level were $4.5 trillion. So this is not going to remove.
I think John calculated 73% tariffs on every single item from every country on earth would be needed to equal the amount of revenues from
in
internal
which case
revenue.
you're not going
and
to
then
get them.
you'd collapse
You're not
the
going to get them.
economy
Right.
in the process.
So frankly, I'm concerned that the U.S. is not only hurting itself, but, and this is where Lynn had good experience, we're not at the table shaping the rules for the future. And particularly given the fact that the U.S. is an innovative economy with services and different technologies, you want to be shaping those rules. So that's a problem. Now, you asked about the global system. And it's very important because, not surprisingly, most of the discussions in the U.S., focus on the U.S. nature of this. It is a big world out there, and we only represent about 13% of the world imports anyway. So will the rest of the world keep trading? Yes. Will it be less efficient? Yes. You can see different trade patterns. You mentioned I was on the Temasek board, so that's in Singapore. You can see different trade patterns already developing in Southeast Asia, Japan, India, the sort of Middle East and Africa. We're not at the heart of those. Now, we won't be excluded because of the nature of our companies and sort of our influence, but we're not really shaping the agenda. We're kind of, coming in later, and frankly, we'll find some of the things aren't to our interest. Will China take advantage of this? Sure. Again, Lynn had this experience. It's quite interesting. It started in the Obama administration, but then the Trump administration followed, which was they refused to appoint somebody to the appellate body of the WTO dispute settlement system. So we were trying to stop the system by not appointing the judges, in a way. Mike Froman was a U.S. trade representative, now president of the Council on Foreign Relations, recently wrote a piece where he's saying, well, all this is dead and gone. I don't think so. As Lynette can tell you, actually, there are people developing an alternative dispute settlement system. They're trying to recreate the WTO with the U.S. not part of it. Now, it won't be as good, it won't be as effective, but we have to keep in mind a little bit that the rest of the world doesn't solely dance to our tune.
I had Dennis Ross here, old colleague, last week. And Dennis talked on the other side, which is politics and diplomacy, which also won't allow a vacuum to form if we choose not to be engaged in leading. We may not want to join alliances, but you know what? Alliances are going to form, and they are not going to be alliances that are in the U.S.'s interest. Witness the photographs of Xi, Putin, and Modi all together. There is no reason for a photograph like that to exist, save a deliberate decision to undertake certain steps and not do other things with respect to Modi. So, not a vacuum.
Well, I'll give you another example, and it's funny, as I was coming here, I was thinking about this one. And you have to check me with Baker on this. But one of the things that, and you're a Mideast hand, I'm not a Mideast hand, Dennis is a Mideast
Lucky
hand.
for you.
Is that, so we had our Secretary of State with Prime Minister Netanyahu sort of going to the West Wall. And I was just thinking, if it were Baker and the Israelis had just bombed Qatar, which, by the way, where we have a military base, to say nothing of giving us a $400 million plane for the president's use, and they're trying to mediate the kind of the terrible issues in Gaza. Would I have expected that Baker would have gone and was buddy-buddy with Netanyahu? That doesn't quite ring right to me, okay? For those of you that don't know the history of this, actually, Netanyahu was a rising deputy foreign minister, said something that was insulting to the United States, and Baker banned him from the State Department. So the point of this is not to be gratuitous again, but what does it say about American power and influence? What will the Qataris and others in the Gulf trust us for security on other issues? And then when we want something, will they be there? So this is a good example of kind of where the details of diplomacy and how you conduct yourself matter at the end of the day. Now, frankly, for Secretary Rubio, I don't necessarily blame him because he doesn't necessarily know what Trump is going to say on these topics. That's one of the distinctions I was drawing with Baker and Bush. These two guys always knew where the other one was, and they could represent U.S. power more effectively.
And there are many anecdotes from the Bush-Baker period in which Baker, with absolute confidence, would tell an interlocutor, you don't believe what I'm saying? Call the president. I will get him for you right now on the phone, and he'll make the point. And he was completely relaxed, completely confident, almost always in making that kind of assertion.
He did play poker now and then.
He did play poker now and then, yes indeed. They were two strong personalities, but it worked, and it worked quite uniquely during that time. Bob, the issue, and this is from both of us, China. How do you deal with, work with, confront, cooperate, compete with China?
So it turns out that Xi Jinping, the president of China, and I were born only about a month or two apart. And I got to know him when he was provincial party secretary, and I visited him. He was vice president and others. And I'll share with you a little anecdote that I found very revealing. So as I was finishing the presidency of the World Bank, we had done a study with the Chinese called China 2030, and it was looking at the next stage of China's structural reforms. And the origin of the report was quite interesting. The World Bank had worked with China on the policy issues, not just the financing, going all the way back to Deng Xiaoping in 1980. So a lot of trust in the relationship. And this report, frankly, identified a lot of the issues that China was facing today. But I was going out, and Xi was coming in as president, general secretary. And so I had a meeting with him, and it was not a seminar. I had a chance to ask a couple of questions, not too many. And so I said, Mr. President, what are your development priorities? And I'll always remember, because he was very straightforward with me, and he said, the 86.68 million members of the Communist Party. And I remember because the numbers are transversed. Okay. Now, the relevance of this was, by this time I'd had a lot of conversations with presidents, prime ministers, chancellors on their economic plans. Not one, if I'd asked them about their economic plans, would have given me their party membership. It was kind of a clue as to where he was trying to sort of go with China. So Xi has moved the system in a more repressive way. He's clearly has an industrial and technology strategy. I think there are some structural issues, as we were discussing with John, about the imbalances of the Chinese economy with savings and investment and not enough on the consumption, too much reliant on export-led growth, that while China is not 10 foot tall, it's also a formidable economic player. So what should the U.S., and look, if China had its preference, it certainly would prefer to be the hegemon in East Asia and Asia. Globally, I don't know. People can sort of debate that point of view. So to me, the starting point goes to the fact that you want to work with your allies to deter any dangerous military action. Okay, so this brings us back to Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, others, and of course our own military and the ability to innovate and develop the military for a different set of problems in the Western Pacific. You probably don't want to get in economic conflicts with your best allies at that point. So it's good that Japan wants to invest more. It's good that South Korea takes responsibilities. But you start with that alliance partnership, which, as I mentioned, goes back 70 or 80 years. But now Japan can play a greater role, just as Germany will on the European side. Then on the economic side, obviously you want to have what I hope are constructive relations with your allies. With China, you have to decide, together the US and China represent about 44% of the global economy. Do you think you can contain China? I don't think you can. And frankly, anybody who knows the region know the Chinese sort of integration with the rest of the economy. So to what degree on the security side do you disconnect? I understand the need for some export controls, but don't fool yourself. They'll give you a few years at best because the Chinese or any system sort of can work around them. And then the question is, can you have the type of discussions with the Chinese where you also talk about mutual interests, okay? Whether they be climate issues, whether they be other security issues. Notice how President Trump is trying to see whether he can get China to play a role with Russia or Ukraine. And while this would be a stretch, and I don't think Xi will rush to do it, remember when Putin started to talk about using tactical nuclear weapons, the Chinese kind of said, oh, we don't think this is a very good idea, okay? And so I think we're going to be in a long period here where, frankly, our strength depends on what we do at home, what we do with our allies. You have the deterrence. I'm not of the view that trying to cut off from the Chinese economy will be productive from either side. There's just a lot of, if you're a farmer, again, this is more cotton territory, but I mean, if you're in the northern plains with soybeans and others, we lost a huge amount of sales to China, about $28 billion. Now, in the last Trump term, they subsidized the farmers about $22 billion. By the way, that's not so good for our debt. You know, so, and there's lots of products that the US and China, to be frank, you know, I don't know if you want to pay more for appliances and all the things that we get for China, but I don't really want to protect less efficient US industries. Then we come to issues like, I mentioned solar power, but take battery. Well, maybe if the Chinese actually did some battery investments in the US, like the Japanese had done with their, maybe we would learn some of the different technologies. So it has to be a modulated approach, but one thing for sure is that if you look at everything with China through the eyes of confrontation, you're maximizing the risks of very dangerous things happening. And nobody wants those. So it's going to be an issue where we have to manage some of the differences. Having said this, I'm not naive, as I mentioned with Xi, about he or his team's sort of willingness to sort of change the system, but I do think we can reach some accommodations.
Bob, talk a bit about something which John is going to be leading here over the course of the year to come, which is a deep look at depopulation, demographics, impact on society, economics, tax bases. Are we seeing, as some would say, peak China now or not?
Well, the data on China are revealing about some of the uncertainty. So I mentioned this to some of the students who raised this, is that over the past 5 or 6 years, the Chinese birth and marriage rate has absolutely plummeted. So it's lower than it was during Mao's famines, lower than the Soviet Union from 91 to 95. There's something happening psychologically that's sort of driving that. And this will increase costs for them. But I would broaden the issue, which is that this is a demographic phenomenon you see all around the world. I mean, Japan and Korea are leading the way on this. They have less than half the replacement rate of their populations. These are shrinking societies. In Italy, the birth rate is lower than it was since the country was united in the 1870s. And by the way, it's of course happening here, but then this brings us to the immigration issue. The US numbers are a little better because in the past we've had migration. I understand the difference between legal and illegal migration. I want to secure the borders too, but I think it would be a big mistake if we cut ourselves off with the talent flow. And then going back to the economics, as you mentioned, you know, as I said to the students, who's going to pay my Social Security if we don't do this, or my Medicare payments? And so you've got people living longer, but you also have smaller entrants in the workforce. Now, even if you live in the world of AI, there's a new aspect of this, which is, okay, what will it do to jobs, particularly at the sort of the front end? And no one knows so what I'm talking about is like recent college graduates, that level of entry-level jobs. But, the history of this is one where people and systems adapt. One of the challenges of being a trade representative in 2001 was, as I was talking about sort of bringing in more competition, and at times some jobs would go away in the United States, I couldn't say, oh, guess what? In 2007, somebody's going to invent something called the iPhone. And you don't know what it is yet, but it'll be there. And there'll be all these businesses and sort of apps and different sort of development. The nature of an open competitive society is you create opportunities for that. But in the world of trade, people who are feeling that time is passing them by, they're going to resist. And the ones that are sort of representing the future, many of them don't yet exist. So whether it's AI or trade, I mean, we do have to figure out how to help people adapt to change. And some of this is education, some of this is support networks. Frankly, there have been a lot of efforts at this that haven't sort of worked very well. Place-based strategies don't work as well. This is where, to be honest, Texas is an interesting example. If you have a more open economy and sort of don't put on too many regulatory burdens, you can create new opportunities for people. And I think that's where the strength of the U.S. has to be.
Peak China?
I don't think China has reached its peak. I've never accepted this idea that China was going to overwhelm the United States, because I could see whether demographics or some of these structural issues impinging on China. So I think that, frankly, the data from China is somewhat unreliable. I'm beginning to worry about the data from the U.S. too. But I think it will have modest growth, and part of its bigger challenge will be, just as the U.S. had, you're going to have to move from a manufacturing economy to a services economy. And this has been part of the political challenge in the United States and some of the issues. But again, just to give you an example that most people are probably unaware of, people talk about the manufacturing sector in the United States. I bet people in this audience are unaware. The U.S. manufacturing output exceeds that of Germany, Japan, South Korea, and India combined. Okay? Now, what about all the jobs? Well, guess what? Productivity increased, so you've got more output. U.S. manufacturing exports between 2001 and 21 doubled, okay? And so this is what societies do when they become more productive. I come from the Midwest. So in 1900, 40% of Americans were involved in agriculture. Now it's 1% to 2%, and they're far more productive. It's the nature of these societal transitions. My point is that the United States still has to adjust with this, but China will also have to adjust with it. And so I think China will remain a very important economy, but I don't think yet, I'd argue, it's reached its peak. And in some technological areas, it's very impressive.
Two questions from the audience, very good ones. First is about your old organization, the World Bank. What's the role for the IFIs, the international financial institutions? How's the bank doing today?
Well, I made a practice of, when I left the institution, of sort of not commenting on how it's doing, just because I think when you leave, you leave. I will now say that the current president is a person who I think is doing a good job of leadership. He was the CEO of MasterCard, and I served with him on the Temasek board. And so I think he's trying to steer the institution through a great time of change internationally, as the question suggested. But to go to the core question, these multilateral institutions can't solve every problem, but they're like a thin network in tissue, that the nation states are the most important players. but they have a connectivity that at times can serve as neutral ground, sometimes as catalysts for discussion, sometimes as knowledge centers that we should not throw away easily. So to give you a point of comparison, when I was at the World Bank, in a good year, we might have done $60–70 billion of different types of grants or long-term loans or loans without interest. Now that number actually can be a little bit higher. That's not, a drop in the bucket, but compared to international financial markets, it is a drop in the bucket. So the question is, how do you use your financing to help countries make reforms, make changes so that they can draw in private capital and frankly strengthen their own systems, so and share knowledge from around the world. So to give you one interesting example, Mexico 20 years ago started a program called Oportunidades. People here who dealt with Mexico may know about it. It was about 0.5% of GDP, but it basically gave cash payments to the 15% of the poorest people if they sent their kids to school and if the women got health checkups. Probably did more for women's health in Mexico than anything else. By the time I left the World Bank, this is now 10, 12 years ago, that expanded to like 40 different countries. And Brazil, which had Bolsa Familia, basically Lula came in, he wanted to do something from Hungary, he didn't know what to do, so we showed him this program. And it's, whether across the political spectrum, been sort of a very popular program. So the interesting thing now is, 50 years ago, developing countries didn't really have models of other developing countries they could look to. Now they do. And so there's a tremendous amount of sort of learning and knowledge transfer, institutional transfer, the role of corruption, governance, and these institutions can make a difference. So again, going back a little bit to the Baker style, as you mentioned, I was at the World Bank at the time of the global financial crisis. Many people may not remember, but there was a huge food price surge in 2008 as well. And I actually worked with the World Food Program and others to we created a special trust fund, and Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's now head of the WTO, helped do this for me, where we helped raise funds for either food or basic inputs for agriculture. And so 5 years later, when I left, the Rwandan agriculture minister, a woman, said to me, Bob, in the first year, you helped us make sure we got seeds and inputs that otherwise we wouldn't have been able to plant. In the third year, you did a program where we had terracing so as to increase the productivity. Rwanda's a very hilly country. And then in the fifth year, we had IFC, the private sector, do a loan for storage because we were so successful. So these are the differences that you can make. Now, my point about the global financial crisis was, ironically, because I was an American, I had a better sense of the international system and how to maneuver it on issues like the international food, or another one was trade finance. As you recall, when the financial crisis hit, the banking regulators all wanted to shut the barn door after the horse had left. They were increasing capital requirements, including on trade finance. And all the developing countries would have gotten really squeezed on this. So I worked with Pascal Lamy, the head of the WTO, and with Standard Chartered Bank, and we kind of showed the data to say, look, these aren't the countries that caused the problem, you're going to really hurt them. So it goes to this notion of problem solving. How can you as an institution use your resources and knowledge to make a difference? Now, it's not going to solve all the problems of the world, but these things save lives.
Two questions going back to the past. First has to do with WTO, bringing China in. Was there anything that, as an alternative course, that could have been done, should have been done, to try to direct China to be a more positive player in a structured global trade world, or was what happened inevitable?
So you need to have a seminar with Lennon on this, and she was there at the time. But it's a really good question because a lot of people have forgotten it. My own view is that after Deng Xiaoping decided he was going to engage China with the world, we were not going to be able to say no, it won't happen. It's a little bit like who lost China in 1949, or maybe China wasn't ours to lose. So I think China would have gone on its own development path. The question was, did it make sense to try to integrate them into the world system? And as Linda knows, if you actually look at the Chinese accession agreement, they lowered barriers a huge amount. It was the fastest growing export market for the United States until actually the first sort of Trump administration. And so there are a lot of benefits for the U.S. as well as the international system. In terms of the implementation of requirements, and Lena may have a deeper sense of this, my sense is that on the quantitative commitments that China made, which by the way were far in extensive of other developing countries, they by and large kept to those. The problem was the qualitative ones, IPR enforcement, forced technology transfer, those sort of issues. Now, then you face the question of, okay, so what are you going to do about those? And my own view is this is why I don't think disengagement with China will be constructive. I think there are reasons why it makes sense to work with the Chinese to either say, look, if you don't fix these problems, we will take various action, but also in things like intellectual property. China's now a technology society. It has an interest in intellectual property protection. So what I'm trying to describe is the world doesn't often produce perfect solutions. You from the Middle East, you particularly know this. But so with China, the accession of China had a lot of benefits for the United States, China, and the world. And I'm not sure, at least I'm very skeptical of the idea that you could have stopped China. And frankly, then you have to do the counter, sort of factual. Then if you tried to stop China, what would have been the effect?
Last one from the audience was German reunification, NATO expansion. Looking back now, and I've asked Jim Baker the same question, was there something different that could have been done during that period before, during, and in the 3 or 4 years until the ruble crash, following the establishment of the Russian Federation, to set Russia, NATO, Russia-West relations on a different course, or was this too beyond our ability to shape?
So let me break this into 3 parts. First, I recently, actually, it's coincidental that you asked this question. I wrote a piece for the Frankfurter Allgemeine.
It wasn't coincidental. I read the piece.
Where there was a view that Putin has pressed about how the United States had pledged not to enlarge NATO, which is totally false. And I took people through the background of it. And in essence, here's the points. There's a point in a fast-moving process where Baker sort of says he's posing a hypothetical to the Soviets in Moscow, saying, look, it's a question of, could you unify Germany and NATO? And of course, the Soviets aren't going to like this idea. So he's trying to get them to recognize, well, we saw in the 20th century when Germany was a power in the center of Europe without linking of NATO, would you rather it be a unified country on its own or sort of part of the NATO structure? And then he said, without sort of 1 inch further east of he used jurisdiction. He then, within like days, shifts from jurisdiction, and of course the Soviets don't pick up on it, but it picks to the notion of a special status. And the reason why this is so frustrating is if you go and look at the 2+4 settlement agreement, which I negotiated, there is a special status for the East. It was special, it was treated in a variety of different ways. And so that was done. And the idea, anybody who's dealt with Russians, that they would say, oh, yeah, well, Baker mentioned this to us, so we didn't feel a need to write it down or put it in the treaty or any agreement like that. It's just total poppycock that would happen, okay? The second example is the fact that the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Shevardnadze, and Russia, Kozyrev, both say there was no promise not to extend it to the East. The third one was quite interesting, which is that the key moment is in a meeting in the cabinet room where Bush is across from Gorbachev, and Bush is trying to persuade Gorbachev, this is in late May or in 1990, to accept German unification in NATO. And he says, and it was something I had discovered, there's something called CSCE, which is a series of principles going back to the Helsinki Accord. And CSCE has a principle saying that each country should be free to choose their own alliance. So Bush says to Gorbachev, you know, look, we believe Germany should be in NATO. I understand you may not take that view, but can you at least accept the principle under CSCE that Germany has the right to choose? And Gorbachev says, yes. And I've probably never been in such a dramatic meeting because the people on the Soviet side go, ooh, and so Bob Lacko, the NSC assistant, hands me a note. He said, did you hear this? Should we get the president to ask him again? And I, yes. So the president asks again, and Gorbachev says, yes. And at one point, Gorbachev gets nervous, and he said, oh, maybe this should be left to the ministers. And Shevardnadze says, no, I think you've got this issue. So Gorbachev accepts the principle that countries are free to choose their own alliance. That was the sort of the key moment. So where does this go? Okay. Then there's one more step, which is even more sort of insight. But on the night before the treaty was signed, we have this hiccup in Moscow. We're negotiating in Moscow because we had a restriction in the agreement for non-German NATO forces in the former East Germany. And so the question was so whether they could be deployed there was the issue. And I'm at the table thinking, this shows a little benefit of anticipation. This is 1990. Someday Poland may want to be in NATO. And if that's true, we want to be able to go across East Germany to get to Poland. So the British and the Americans kind of raise this concern. The Germans go bat crazy because the Soviets then say, oh, we're going to throw it off. I knew that they would agree at the end of the day. And we come up with a minute that sort of defines that it'll be up to United Germany to define the meaning of deployment. So you've got all these sort of examples, okay, about that, okay? But it's a good example of how Putin will use disinformation to shape the process. Now, to take it to the next step, however, you then say, okay, should we have enlarged, one question, should we have enlarged NATO? I was an early supporter of NATO enlargement because I was always concerned that in a post-Cold War world, if you left Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and others as the lands between, at that time it was still Soviet Union or Russia and Germany, this would not be healthy. And if you think about the 30s and others, and think about what's going on in the Polands and Baltics today, I thought it was important to try to give them the reassurance of NATO. But then you take one more step, which is, could you have done more with Russia? This is a question historians, by the way, the voters in their wisdom threw us out of office, so this was not our question. But I think if you look at the Clinton administration, they put in a lot of money, they tried very hard, but frankly, the nature of the structural changes in the Soviet Union, and ultimately the Russian reform team, I think, made some mistakes on this, but this was a bridge too far. I had worked closely with Poland, and Poland was in itself a close case in terms of going through the reform process. So I'll bring this back a little bit to the same point I made about kind of losing China or whether we could stop China. Sometimes, understandably, there's an American tendency to say, you know, like, we're all powerful, we could wave the wand and make this happen. To be honest, the Russians had a lot to say about their own future, okay? And we could help and facilitate. There were efforts in the Bush administration late on that we tried to engage some of the reformers to see if we could produce a support package, but Gorbachev still really didn't understand market economics. So, Baker gave you a similar answer?
What the Secretary said was...
Much more briefly than I did,
and
no doubt.
it's an interesting point because it's fundamentally yours on agency on the part of the country. He said, what were we supposed to do after the legacy of 40-plus years of Soviet domination, abuse, criminal behavior towards the populations of the Baltics, Eastern Europe? Those countries come and ask to join NATO against the possibility of a revanchist Russia, and we were to say no, what moral standing would we have had? That was his comment.
Now you know why Baker was the secretary and I was the aide, because I gave a long answer, he hits it in a punchy.
But, Bob, thank you so much. Fabulous presentation. critical issues now and in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks.
Excellent.
Thank you all.